But it turned out there's 41.7 million Americans on SNAP benefits. SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it's determined based on household income levels, once known as the food stamp program. So that 41.7 million Americans is 12.3% of all Americans. So that's not good news. That's a lot of Americans on government assistance, federal government assistance.
So who are these people who are receiving SNAP benefits and who are so reliant and dependent on it? Among the children in families receiving SNAP benefits, 53% of those children live in single-parent families. And of those, 49% are mothers, single mothers who are either divorced, separated, or were never married. So the vast majority of families receiving SNAP benefits are single-parent families. And it just harkened back in my mind about the sad state of families in America and the need to revive the American family and to strengthen it, because this is a great example of what happens when families dissolve. The statistics are there and they're undeniable that families and children do better when they stay together. Friends, and welcome back to another episode of Fire for Effect, episode 18. I'm here with co-host Jim McBride, and I'm Marcus Moyer. Our other hosts were not able to make it today for one reason or another, so it's just Jim and I this morning. But a lot of things are happening in our world that I'm sure everybody's already tracking in the news. The government shutdown being the one that is foremost on most people's minds. So we'll talk about that. The fact that it's over is the big news, but I think we also learned a lot of very interesting things from the last 40 plus days that was ongoing. 43 days. That's a record that we didn't want to break, but now a new record has been set. Longest government shutdown in U.S. history, 43 days. A trial and a tribulation to many people, but a lesson. Some very valuable lessons and insights, I think, came out of that, as painful as it was. So we'll talk about that a little bit here as well. Jim, how you doing this morning?
Great. I love the weather this time of year, and blue skies, crisp chill in the air, and here in Charleston, South Carolina. And to your introduction there about the government shutdown, it's officially over. I think President Trump signed it into law or legislation last night, I think it was. So we're recording this on 13 November. So it's good that that's over with and that drama's over with. And to our episode last week, I wonder how much that affected the elections that happened a couple weeks ago. It's hard to say for sure. Who took the blame, left or right, Republicans, Democrats, whatever. So who knows, but glad it's over. And it did expose a lot of things about how things operate in America, unbeknownst to 99% of the population, including us, until the shutdown happened. So yeah, it'll be good to kind of peel some onion layers back on that. But yeah, doing good overall.
Yeah, so just a quick synopsis of how that government shutdown went. Of course, it started October 1st, failure to pass a budget, which that's not so unusual. Think it's more the rule than the exception that Congress can't pass a budget. But normally we can at least get a continuing resolution or something that keeps the lights on and keeps things flowing. and we kind of stumble along, kicking the can down the road. Congress is notorious for that. But this particular shutdown started October 1st, 2025. Funding lapsed. The Senate passed a funding bill on November 10th, finally, to reopen the government. Everybody was tracking that standoff. And of course, representatives from both sides were coming out every day trying to convince the American public that it was the other side that was the problem. Republicans were coming. Speaker of the House Johnson was very good at coming out daily and trying to keep the people appraised. And of course, pointing out that, all we need is a handful of Democrats in the Senate to join the Republicans, and we can pass this bill and get things rolling again. Chuck Schumer coming out from the Senate and trying to convince the public that it's actually the Republicans that are a problem here. They're holding the American people hostage. They don't want to fund health care. They're taking food out of the mouths of women and children, not paying SNAP benefits and that sort of thing. So it was the usual back and forth, and it's just a matter of who are the people going to believe and what are they going to do with that information. And as you pointed out, Jim, the House of Representatives the Senate finally passed that funding bill on November 10th. I believe it was 8 Democrats that came over to vote with the Republicans to reopen the government. And a lot of them are catching a lot of heat for that, Chuck Schumer being first and foremost among them. It was one of my Virginia senators who actually came over as well, Tim Kaine, who came over and voted with the Republicans. I thought it was interesting. As I said last week, I was pretty sure, my first instinct at least, was that the shutdown wouldn't last past October 19th, which is when the early voting really started in earnest here in Virginia. But we blew way past that, went all the way through the election on November 4th, and finally opened back up after the president signed this bill that the House passed on November 12th, so just last night. I thought it was interesting that the Democrats held out on this shutdown long enough to reap the benefits in the recent election on November 4th, because it was very clear and not really surprising that the Democrats in Democrat strongholds blamed the Republicans and took out their anger at the polls, which, by the way, is where you should take your anger out, whether it's legitimate or misplaced anger or not. The polls is where you do that, not on the street, not through political violence, as we've seen in recent days, sadly. So that is kind of how it started and how we got here 43 days later, reopening the government. Still lingering impacts to air traffic control. We can talk about that in a little bit as well. But that was on a lot of people's minds, the impact to the national airspace system, air traffic controllers, airlines, et cetera, who were starting to scale back their operations due to lack of funding, right on the cusp of the holidays. So that was on a lot of people's minds. And then, of course, the benefits, SNAP being the one that was front and center for the large portion of the discussion. SNAP being, for those who may not know, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, a program that the government uses to help families who are struggling, low-income families, and things of that nature. So that's the rundown of how we got here. And I'd like your perspective, Jim, on what did we learn in those 43 days about our government and about our population?
Well, first I'll start with the messaging. You both alluded to, who took the blame, which party took the blame for the shutdown, how did that affect the election? And, I have friends on Facebook and just in my life, on both sides of the aisle. So I see both arguments flying around social media. And the easy argument to blame Republicans that I saw being thrown around, that's easy to just digest. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense, is that the Republicans are in charge of the presidency and both chambers of Congress. So therefore, it's a Republican shutdown. That just makes sense. It makes sense. It's just like, oh, okay, yeah, Republicans are in charge. Shutdown happened on their watch. It's their fault. that's the easy argument, and I would say that the left, the Democrats, are very good at those easy arguments that are easy to digest, to persuade people. However, the counter argument, which has a little bit more substance to it, is that it takes a supermajority, if I'm using the right term, to prevent a filibuster, to allow the shutdown to happen. So each time it was voted on, a majority of the House and the Senate voted to end the shutdown, but there wasn't a supermajority. And correct me if I'm using the wrong term there on supermajority, but there wasn't a filibuster-proof vote to allow it to not happen. So Republicans did vote. The Republicans in charge of the presidency and Congress did vote for it and had a majority and voted for it every time. But it took enough Democrats to come over to, and the House, and in fact, the House passed it several times. It was the Senate. It was the Senate that didn't get enough votes to overcome the filibuster. So, and the reason the Democrats gave, the number one primary reason they gave for keeping the government closed, was that the Republicans refused in the negotiation to extend Obamacare, Affordable Care Act supplements, I think it was, or extra benefits that were put in place many years ago, 10 or so years ago, to keep Obamacare afloat. During COVID, there was temporary financial assistance given to buttress Obamacare, which was already crumbling and falling apart, 10 years ago. And during COVID, they wanted to shore it up a little bit temporarily. So the Democrats, under Democrat control, passed a bill. I think it was in the Inflation Reduction Act, which I brought up, I think, last week. I think it was in that bill, to add temporary, due to COVID, supplements to Obamacare that they decided to let expire at a certain point, which happened to happen right now. So it was always designed to be temporary. These supplements, they were set to expire, which the Congress under Democratic control set the expiration date, which happened to be now. So the Republicans were like, well, no, we're not going to agree to keep extending these benefits just to keep the government from shutting down when you wanted them to expire in the first place, and they're supposed to be temporary. But that's how things work in our government. Things that are temporary rarely are temporary. When it comes to adding, a tax burden to the taxpayer to help something temporarily, rarely becomes temporary and usually ends up becoming permanent. What's the phrase? The two sure things in life are death and taxes. So the more we're taxed, it's very, very rare that those taxes are reduced. So this is another example of that. And then the other thing, you mentioned the SNAP benefits, and I'll put the chart on the screen. And again, I mentioned last week, we do this podcast to be able to, you can just listen to it, but we put on the screen, if you watch it on Spotify or YouTube, a lot of helpful charts and data and things like that. So you can watch, and I'll put this on there, but looking at usafacts.org, and they said that regarding the SNAP benefits that were set to expire or to not get funded while the government was shut down, they were about to run out. I think they did run out. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Trump administration funded, I think, half of the benefits for a while last week or something like that. But it turned out there's 41.7 million Americans on SNAP benefits. SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it's determined based on household income levels, once known as the food stamp program. We know the common vernacular of food stamps. It's administered by the Department of Agriculture, provides food assistance to low-income individuals. So that 41.7 million Americans is 12.3% of all Americans. So that was a major revelation for a lot of people. Like, whoa, there's that many Americans on SNAP benefits, that's not good news. And again, I'll show this chart, but the SNAP benefits has increased dramatically from, this chart shows from 1970 to current times. The worst period looks like it was about 2014, I think was the highest peak. And it went down a little bit. It's gone up again a little bit, but yeah, that's a lot of Americans on government assistance, federal government assistance. So it's my summary of what I learned during this period.
Yeah, so I'll come back to SNAP in a second, but just to clarify what you were talking about for folks before, the simple math, the simple argument, like you were talking about, like it only takes 51%, right? A majority to pass something. And technically that is true. That is a majority. And in the Senate, the Republicans currently hold 53 of the seats. And so the simple argument, which is kind of what the Democrats were relying on, was that the Republicans have a majority. And so if they wanted the government to open, they could do it. To your point, though, there's a nuance to it that for most bills, yes, a simple majority is sufficient. You just need 51 out of the 100 votes in the Senate. However, one of the tools that are available in the Senate to the minority party is this thing called a filibuster, which is just an extended debate. They can draw it out, by keeping the debate open on the floor. And in order to shut that down, you have to have 60 votes to invoke what they call cloture, which is just a fancy name for ending the debate. And so you really kind of need 60 votes in order to be able to pass something and end a filibuster. And so that's what they were after. And with only 53 seats, the Republicans really needed 7 Democrats to join them. So that's why it wasn't, to Jim's point, that's why it wasn't as simple as it sounds like it should be for the majority party to just do what they want. What you were saying there about the SNAP benefits, I was shocked by that too, to find out that more than 10% of America's population is reliant on this government program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Just over 12% of the 330 million Americans that we have, 41.7 million, as you said, Jim, are on this program. I also found it interesting that, as you said, the amount of the benefit each month is dependent on your household size, your income level, etc. But on average, SNAP benefits are $188 per month for each family. And so if you do the math, if you have 41.7 million Americans on this benefit at $188 a month each, that's $7.8 billion a month in this program. And now that I think about it, that might not be exactly right, because it's 41.7 million people, not 41.7 million households. So these numbers are going to be a little on the high side. But $7.8 billion a month over an annual period, that's over $90 billion a year funding this program. So who are these people who are receiving SNAP benefits and who are so reliant and dependent on it? Because people were really starting to freak out when they thought they weren't going to get this. I did some quick research on it. Among the children in families receiving SNAP benefits, 53% of those children live in single-parent families. And of those, 49% are mothers, single mothers who are either divorced, separated, or were never married. And 4% of that population is representing single-parent fathers. And all of that is according to the Institute for Family Studies. So the vast majority of families receiving SNAP benefits are single-parent families. And it just harkened back, in my mind, to a conversation we had several weeks ago about the sad state of families in America and the need to to revive the American family and to strengthen it, because this is a great example of what happens when families dissolve. The statistics are there, and they're undeniable that families and children do better when they stay together, when there's a father in the home, and when it's done the right way. 40.1% of single female parent households with children participated in SNAP, compared with only 3.9% of married coupled households without children. That's according to USA Facts. So that's a huge disparity in your likelihood to be reliant on government programs if you are not a married couple living in a household. I just found that striking.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll put that chart up. I'm looking at the same chart you're looking at. I think it's striking the difference, and it's just stunning to me that marriage, the institution of marriage, is not supported by all political parties and stripes, because it's clear, and we talked about this on another episode several weeks ago. I think it was redeeming redeeming masculinity. We talked a lot about this. I think the importance of fathers in the home and the importance of marriage. And humans are humans. There's always problems with all factions of humanity, in America and around the world. But by and large, statistics prove over and over and over again that married couples, is the best institution to raise children and to have a healthy, income and lifestyle. And it's just not something that's talked about much, unfortunately, in our society. It's became verboten in a lot of circles, as being sexist and all that stuff, which is just ridiculous.
And it's viewed as primarily a religious or a Christian argument.
Yeah.
This defense of marriage, and there's a lot of people out there who reject any idea, even if it's a good one, if it's attached to what they perceive to be Christian morals or Christian principles. They really bristle at that. But these statistics seem to bring out that moral and religious argument aside, it's a good economic policy
100%.
To really
And
encourage
it's
and
better for kids.
incentivize
It's better for
marriage
kids.
and to keep it together. Right. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if for no other reason, you can take church and state separation, Christianity's good, bad, whatever. You can take that almost completely out of the equation and just look at the economics of it. And even a secular government should recognize that it's bad economic policy to foster an environment that doesn't encourage families to stay together and makes it easy for them to separate.
Yeah, and last week we talked a lot about the dangers of socialism, and here's a tangible example right here, because a socialist mindset, socialist government wants people dependent on the government, and rather than independent of the government, able to create their own wealth and take care of their own families. And so that's, by the way, partly why, or largely why, there's all this attack on Christianity by many of those on the left, not all of those on the left, but many on the left, but especially those who are pro-socialist, pro-communist. That's why they attack Christianity, because Christianity does promote values that leads to self-sufficient, by and large, married couples in a stable family home, which makes them less dependent on government. So to me, it's very clear why there's such an attack on Christianity and stable families. So yeah, hopefully, this kind of thing does open the eyes of a lot of Americans to this kind of thing. How many Americans pay attention to these details? I don't know. How many will remember this, a year from now? I don't know. I know that shutdowns tend to get forgotten about very quickly, and I think the Trump administration and the Republicans in the House and Senate were wise to that. Oh, one more thing related to that. The shutdown also showed that the government kind of keeps going, even though we got it shut down. And you mentioned the air traffic control issue. That was a real issue and is a real issue. It's started to have an impact. And on flights, I think there was like 10% of flights were getting canceled by certain airlines the last week or so because of the shutdown. And you can argue it makes air travel a little bit less safe because apparently if air traffic controllers or the ones that were working, weren't getting paid. I'm not sure the full extent of that, but I know that Trump administration, I heard, was going to give a like a $10,000 bonus to those air traffic controllers who stayed on the job, even though they weren't getting paid. So that's pretty cool. Um, but by and large, government kept going, which just kind of proves, and people live their lives and were pretty much oblivious, unless you live in the D.C. area. So I think probably the biggest hit area was Washington D.C. because so much of Washington D.C. Exists and is in the ecosystem of the federal government, jobs and that kind of thing. But 99% of the country feels very little impact to a shutdown. Again, until it got to the SNAP benefits, things like that started to hit people's pocketbooks that rely on that kind of thing. But I think it just shows again how bloated our government is, and all these programs that every year Congress votes in more money going towards certain programs because they're indispensable. Well, we kind of keep proving every time we have a shutdown, especially a long shutdown like this, that they're not necessarily indispensable, or maybe they can be pared back, or maybe some money can be pulled back. But who knows if Congress will learn these lessons or not, and if the people will remember these things to hold Congress accountable on these issues.
Yeah, you make a really good point that if you're part of the population that doesn't work for the government, and therefore your paycheck doesn't come from them, and you're not a part of the population that receives benefits from the government routinely, then a government shutdown is almost, completely transparent to you, which I think is good. That's kind of the way it should be. Government shouldn't be so big that when there's a ripple or a wrinkle in government operations that is somehow, is devastating to the entire country.
Yep.
So that would not be a good situation.
You should be
The
able to make an income and live your life at the local level without any assistance from federal government. That's kind of the whole point of the Republican form of government we're supposed to have, and states' rights and things like that. Again, 10th Amendment, seems to not function very well because the federal government has its fingers in so much of society and so much of, programs, private and public programs around the country, a little bit too much.
Yeah, I don't remember who it was that gave the speech, but they made a statement very similar that the government should never do a thing for somebody that they can and should do for themselves.
Yeah.
And we've strayed pretty far from that. Um, and I know there are a lot of people out there who legitimately need help. Um, sometimes they find themselves in that position of need because of a series of unfortunate circumstances and bad decisions. But regardless of how they got there, they're now in a position where they need help. There are others, though, who take advantage of these programs because it doesn't seem to be very stringent in terms of the scrutiny that goes into who gets certain benefits. And that's a big concern for a lot of people, that we're spending, $100 billion, $90 to $100 billion a year on a program like SNAP. And the average American probably has no idea how they determine who gets those benefits and whether or not it's warranted. And they would be right to question it. I mean, as Americans, we have a right to question anything our government does. That's the point of holding it accountable. And yet so much of what the government does, not only do we not understand, we wouldn't be told even if we were asked, or even if we asked. And that's also not a good place to be, where the government knows everything about you, and you and I know very little about the government. That relationship is completely inverse to the way it should be.
100%. Yep. And you brought up just a minute ago about, I forget how you worded it, something about how, too much of the population's supported by the government and can't necessarily function without government, federal government assistance. Offline before the podcast, you had mentioned that what institutions should be stepping up to help people who are in need, because we're not denying people are in need. At all points in life, different people are in need for different reasons. Even well-off people, go through a rough divorce or have a serious medical problem. Financial strain can hit anybody, or somebody who's just right out of college or right out of high school and having a hard time getting a job. Like, people are in need. There's no doubt about it. We talked about last week how our economy is very, it's gotten, because of inflation, mostly speaking in 2022, 40-year high inflation, it's just devastated and still devastating the economy and making it very hard to live on a single income in this country. Anyway, point being, people are understandably in need often for a lot of reasons. And you and I don't necessarily think that it's the government's job to help those people unless absolutely necessary. So I'll just pass it off to you, because that was your point you brought up ahead of time as to who should be the one that's helping.
Yeah. So while you were talking, I went back and I found the person who said this, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't know it off the top of my head, but it's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln said, "You cannot help men permanently by doing for them what they can and should do for themselves. But there are those among us who would say that the best way to help people is to literally live their lives for them, to assume their responsibilities, to take away from them their accountability, their dignity, and pride." That last part wasn't Lincoln. The last part was by Richard Winder, a speech that he gave a number of years ago called "This I Have Done." So there are those among us who would say that it is best to help people. The best way to help people is to literally live their lives for them, to assume their responsibilities, to take away from them their accountability, their dignity, and their pride. And I would say that we see politicians now, that is their platform. That's what they run on. A New York City mayor was just elected on that platform. Arnold Toynbee, who is an English historian, did some study into this and had a good bit to say about it. And he wrote in his study of 21 civilizations that 19 of these civilizations that he studied vanished from the face of the earth, not from some great external force or from other nations conquering them, but because their people lost their faith in God, in their country, and in themselves. They lost the determination to succeed through their own efforts. They became totally dependent upon the state. And Richard Winder said, "How then can you prevent this from happening to this great land of ours?" Talking about the United States. First, he says you have to stand up and speak for America. Be proud of our country and its heritage and the part that you play in it. Second, remind every man, woman, and child with whom you come in contact of the basic fundamentals of good citizenship: loyalty, self-discipline, honor, and the desire for permanent success. And he ended his speech with some thoughts by Dean Alfange, which he summed up when he wrote My Creed. And it went like this: "I do not choose to be a common man. It's my right to be uncommon, if I can. I do not wish to be a kept citizen, humbled and dulled by having the state look after me. I want to take the calculated risk, to dream and to build, to fail and to succeed. I will not trade freedom for beneficence, nor my dignity for a handout. It is my heritage to think and act for myself, to enjoy the benefit of my creations, and to face the world and say, 'This I have done.'" Powerful speech by Richard Winder. So this dependence that people have developed on the state, and as was described by Abraham Lincoln, by Richard Winder, by Dean Alfange, by Arnold Toynbee, all points to the same failure of the same institution, I think, and that is the church. The church is where people are to be taught these things. The church is also the institution that is supposed to care for the widows, to care for the orphans, to care for the downtrodden. And the church, over decades, centuries, has relinquished that role to the state, is my view of it. And because we have been so woefully deficient in the church of teaching the right principles, defending the right institutions, and providing care and help to those who need it, the state has become the husband, the state has become the wife, the state has become the second parent in so many of these relationships and marriages. The state has become the organization that looks after the widow, that looks after the orphan. Where is the church in this? And we have become so apathetic in the American church. We've relinquished all of our biblical and God-given responsibilities. And nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics, and so does religion for that matter. And in the vacuum that was left in the church's absence, the state stepped into that void and took on the role, and they've owned it ever since. And the results have not been good.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And it's a cycle that once more and more people get dependent on government. This is just a theory of mine, so if we were not dependent on government at all for anything, then the church would be stepping up more, because the congregation, the members of the church would be giving more money, because they'd have more they wouldn't be giving as much to taxes. They wouldn't be relying on government as much. They'd be giving more to the local church. But because our taxes are so high, and because more and more people are dependent on the government, that even the church, and when I say the church in this context, I'm talking about the congregation. Like a church is not necessarily a building; it's the congregation. It's the people that belong to that church or the church in general. We all get complacent as a whole that, government normally takes care of this, and we just get conditioned to it. So I know my taxes are so high, which government spends very inefficiently in an overwhelming number of cases. But hey, I'm paying all this money to the government. The government's supposed to take care of that. And there are government functions that I would argue are truly government functions. Plumbing and sidewalks, things like that. Obviously, roads. But when it comes to taking care of people, helping people at the local level, the local church could be the most effective, and used to be the most effective at that. And even if you're not a Christian, whatever your denomination is, Jewish, Islam, whatever, like synagogue, whatever it is, that was I think, I don't know if they've ever said it or wrote much about it, but I think that was partly the founders' idea and vision, that the local religious establishment, and as Christians, we believe that the church, the Christian church, is the most directly we're directly challenged by Jesus to help, again, the downtrodden, the widow, the fatherless, actively, and it should be signs and manifestations of our faith. Is some fruits of our faith is helping people. And again, that because government has become so institutionalized in this country, and it increasingly does more and more, little by little. We talked about earlier, once taxes increase for a new program, that program never seems to go away, even if it's supposed to be temporary. And we get more and more conditioned to it. And our money's limited. We strive to make an income, and we pay taxes every year. And those who pay attention to how much we're paying in taxes, we realize it's a lot. And so it's the cycle adds to the church, stepping back, passively, not even aware probably that they're doing that. And part of it is because if everyone was truly tithing or tithing plus some to the church would have more assets to be able to help more people. But I have found that, most of the churches I've been a member of over the years, over the decades, they do some small things, and sometimes they'll even support some ministries overseas. You talked about how your church supports a lot of ministries overseas. Not ministries overseas, but what's the word I'm looking for? People from your church that go overseas to
Missionaries.
missionaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And that takes money, and that money comes usually from the congregation, from tithes, things like that. But if everybody tithed, and that's an argument we can talk about later on, whether the Bible directs people to tithe 10% or not. I've heard different arguments from different pastors on that one. But just from the stance of relying and expecting the church to help the people in their community, if everyone tithed, gave 10% of their income, the church would be able to help so many people, and it'd be the people that they're helping are in their community. And I've seen this having gone overseas with Samaritan's Purse, to Ukraine and South Sudan, and my wife Lynn's gone to like 10 other places. The local church steps up when crisis happens. Oh, we saw it recently. Was it last year with Hurricane Helene in North Carolina? Went out there to help with that, help the people out there with that. The first organization that stood up before local government, before FEMA, before federal government, before state government, to help the people on the ground were the churches. I know that because we went to Black Mountain and found the first place that was functioning, and it was a church. And the reason it was functioning was because people were coming to the church both to get help and to give help. And it became a natural hub of helping the local people. And that's, in my mind, a vision of how America could be much, much better, is if the people understood and challenged their church and challenged themselves to support their church. Because that's where the local most efficient and effective help on the ground happens. And the last thing I'll say on that is, the more detached of a level of organization, whether it's government or not, even private or government, but we'll talk about government. Washington, D.C., creating a program to help somebody in where John Jones lives in the rural part of North Carolina is the most detached way to take care of somebody and help somebody. And the person that's receiving that paycheck to help the person from the government program may not care much or know much about that local community, and then in the process from DC down to the local town in a small rural part of America, all kinds of chances for corruption. And we see it over and over again. Corruption does happen. Money's siphoned off to other things, used inefficiently. The church is the most efficient way that money is used to help people on the ground. They know the community, they know the people, and if they know the people in the community, they know if they're temporarily needing help and can help them temporarily with resources and funding and support and prayer, and also help them get back on their feet so they don't need long-term help from the church, depending on the situation. Again, some people are sick the rest of their lives for whatever reason, but those who are temporarily in a crisis can get better help to get back on their feet, to get out of that crisis, to be independent again. And when government does it, they end up, it's human nature to kind of become dependent on those subsidies. So yeah, there's so much to be said about how if the church was able and willing, and it's both those things, willing and able, the resources and the willingness to stand up to take that mantle back, to take care of their local communities, America across the country would be so much better.
Yeah. The other side of that coin, though, and I agree with everything that you just said, but because churches and sadly Christians are so unreliable, and it pains me to say that, as a Christian and a churchgoer and a lover of both, we are not a very reliable group sometimes when it comes to this sort of thing. So can you imagine um, living in a community where if you or I were the one who needed help, relying on our local church, and everybody's experience is different. I would feel very comfortable with the church that I go to, but I know my church is I I think, and I'm biased, my church is exceptional. And so I am convinced that if I needed help, my church family would be there in a heartbeat to help me any way that they could. Not everybody has that. And I've been a part of churches and other places where I wouldn't feel as comfortable that that would be the case, sadly. And so the argument, if one is to be made, for the government filling this role, partially or to the extent that it does now, is that the people who benefit from it, allegedly anyway, should also be paying into it taxes, because you said before the only two certain things in life are death and taxes. And so there's at least some kind of a guarantee that the people benefiting are also contributing at some point. And that's not the case at a church, because you can't have compulsory tithe, nor would I advocate for that. That's not good. Um, However, we also know that not everybody in America pays taxes. So not everybody that benefits from the taxpayer dollar is putting anything into the system. So you kind of got the same issue, I guess, regardless of whether the church or the government is doing this. The other thing is that the people who make the decisions, who would make the decisions at a church of who gets assistance and who doesn't, are not elected officials, and the people who are benefiting or not really have no way of affecting or impacting the leadership who determines whether they get assistance or not. When the government fills this role, there is the vote that the recipient and the taxpayer who's funding these programs, both of them can influence future decisions at the ballot box. You don't have that ability in a church, at least not in every church. Some churches elect pastors. Some churches, it's a board that selects a pastor. So it's very inconsistent, uh, the way churches are run and the way they would potentially go about these charitable activities. My church, in addition to supporting over 200 missionaries, also has a beneficence fund that we use to help members of our community. Sometimes people will just come by the church and they'll ask if we can help. They don't go to our church. We don't know them, but if they come, our pastor will meet with them, hear their story, and using some discernment, because there are definitely people who try to take advantage of those sorts of things, and we see those as well. But based on their story and, their sincerity, we use that beneficence fund to help struggling members of our community, which I think is great. Anyway, that was kind of a rambling response to what you were talking about. The church should definitely have a more active and prominent role in caring for people at the community and the local level. But I can definitely see where people would be uncomfortable relying wholly on the church for that and taking the government completely out of the business. But I don't think we have the right mix at the moment.
No. Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah. And again, Charlie Kirk, he was hammering this very point the last couple of years before he died. The church stepping up more and people taking more of a role in their church.
I do think that this is just, one example of societal ill that is caused by an apathetic church and an apathetic Christianity, which we've talked about, at length in recent episodes, how the church has allowed itself to fall into a complacent state where we have totally withdrawn from so many of the arenas that the church is commanded to be active in, and we have what's the phrase I'm looking for? The church is the conscience of the state. And I think the state's conscience has fallen silent. It's allowed itself to be intimidated to the point where the church is almost ineffective as a whole in American society. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, the relevance of the American church. And it's not the gospel's fault. The gospel is and always has been and always will be powerful. Pastor Mike mentioned this, and, the gentleman who visiting 9/11 or visiting New York City after 9/11, was driving around in his car looking at it, saying over and over to himself, the church is the hope of the world. Not the church building, not the Christians in the church. The church is an organization, and the message that it represents, the gospel, is the hope of the world. And yet, we are so timid in proclaiming it. We have the answer to the world's problems. We have the cure for the world's ills. And yet we're so hesitant to share it. For all the reasons we've talked about before. We've become lazy. We've become complacent. There was, in 1970, in August of 1999, I think, is when this was written. This is in the AFA Journal. And this was, somebody read this to me recently and is very convicting. Because when we talk about, the government should do X or the church should do Y, the government's failing, the church is failing. Both of those organizations are me. I am the church. I am the government. And so to the extent that those things are failing, I personally am failing. And that was the point of this article called "That's What Christians Do Now." And I'll just read it if you don't mind.
Sure.
In 1973, the Supreme Court said it was okay to kill unborn babies. And since then, we have killed more than the entire population of Canada. And it continues. A woman's choice, half of those who have died in their mother's wombs have been women. They didn't have a choice. It's called abortion. But me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. First, it was in dingy, dirty theaters, then convenience stores, then grocery stores, then on television. Now it's in the homes of millions via the internet. It's called pornography. Me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. They call it no fault. Why should we blame anyone when something so tragic happens? Haven't they already suffered enough? Half of the marriages in America end this way. The children suffered, the family broke down. It's called divorce. But me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. At one time, it was a perversion. We kept it secret. We secured help and hope for those who practiced it. Now, it's praised. We have parades celebrating it, and elected officials give it their blessing. Now it is endowed with special privileges and protected by laws. Even some Christian leaders and denominations praise it. It's called homosexuality. But me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. It used to be an embarrassment, a shame. Now, a third of all births are to mothers who aren't married. 2/3 of all African American children are born into a home without a father. The state usually pays the tab. That's why we pay our taxes, so that government can take the place of parents. After all, government bureaucrats know much better how to raise children than parents do. It's called illegitimacy. But me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. At one time it was wrong, but then the state decided to legalize it, promote it, and tax it. It's ripped apart families and destroyed lives. But just look at all the money the state has raised. No longer do we have to teach our children to study and work hard. Now we teach them they can get something for nothing. We spend millions encouraging people to join the fun and excitement. Just look at the big sums that people are winning. They never have to work again. It's called gambling. Me, I go to church, the minister preaches, I go home. That's what Christians do now. Not long ago, Christians were the good guys, but now any positive image of Christians in movies or on TV is gone. We are now depicted as the bad guys, greedy, narrow-minded hypocrites. The teacher can't have a Bible on her desk, but can have Playboy. We don't have Christmas or Easter holidays, just winter and spring break. We can't pray in school, but we can use foul language. It's called being tolerant. Me? I go to church. The minister preaches. I go home. That's what Christians do now. Yes, all of these came to pass within 30 years. Where were the Christians? Well, they were in church. All these things are for someone else to deal with. Times have changed. Involvement has been replaced with apathy. But don't blame me. I didn't do anything. I go to church. The minister preaches. I go home. That's what Christians do now. Convicting.
Yeah, very much. It's very true. We are the church. We are the church. Leading by example is one way to help fix that, going out and helping people and doing things that the church says we're supposed to do. Having our neighbors see that we're doing that. Encouraging others to join us. 100%. Want to hit on your point. You said something about how somewhere in that list there was something about just how our culture has changed over time. It made me think of to where Christianity was accepted and kind of more a positive part of our culture. That's what it was. He wrote something about how it's no longer in the movies depicted as a positive thing or in TV shows. And right away my mind went to Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments. Charlton Heston back in the I forget when that was. I'm looking it up right now. The 60s, I think, late 60s. Let's see. Ben-Hur was Academy awarded the Best Picture in 1959. If you haven't seen Ben-Hur, the original Ben-Hur, for those out there listening, an exceptional movie, and it shows the crucifixion of Jesus towards the end, and how his influence was changing the area, changing the culture, kind of in the background of this movie, which is a very, very good movie. And the Ten Commandments was not too far away from that. I don't think it won the Academy Award, but that was back when Christianity was looked at in the culture as a good thing and as a positive influence, and it was really making a difference. And in schools, we've talked about in schools. This could be another topic we could talk about. Just talking about how the Bible being acceptable in schools until certain Supreme Court decisions, I think in the early 70s, took Christianity out of schools, and you can show a very distinct and obvious decline in educational proficiency from that point forward. That's continued to this day. Some people attribute that also to the Department of Education, but that's kind of one and the same. Department of Education, federal government program, kind of helping to impose these mandates from on high, from the Supreme Court, weeding out Christianity and faith in the schools and how that's impacted society. And that doesn't just impact, grades, of course. It impacts how our kids are taught, what they're taught, what the foundation of what they're taught, where it comes from. And then they become adults, and then they become teachers and lawyers, and slowly our culture has drifted away from the faith. The good news in the midst of really bad news during COVID was the ineptitude and the lack of moral clarity that the government depicted, or the government displayed during COVID, with the crazy mask mandates and vaccine mandates and lockdowns. Woke a lot of the younger generation up. I think that's why the current Gen Z male population is the most faith-based and happens to be the most conservative population in at least 50 years. I think it's because they saw what was happening with COVID, and we're like, what are these supposed adults doing? This is insane. And in looking at our culture, which is very government dependent, um, more and more so, and faith has been shunned, and they saw something's not right here, and the internet is almost infinite information when they're able to go back and look and see how culture was, just like I did just now, just researched how faith was more acceptable in our culture decades ago, and I think they look to that, and they're just looking for some structure and some clear morality, and the church, if it's preaching that way, offers that, and it offers that structure based on clear biblical principles and morality. So that's the good news, is when society, at least in this case, when our society has gone so far astray from biblical values that certain parts of the population's eyes open to seeing the, I don't know, the depravity of a faithless society, and it helps them to turn back towards looking for that faith. So that's some, I guess, temporary good news. We'll see how it plays out over the next decade or two.
Yeah. So as you said, the bad news is that we're the problem, as the church, as the government, all of which are made up of me and people like me. So that's the bad news, that I'm the problem. The good news is that we're also the solution. We're part of the solution. I'm reminded of a song that the Collingsworth family sings called "Jesus is Still the Answer," and he always has been and always will be. Jesus is the answer, and we can avail ourselves of that. And it comes down to those three things that Charlie Kirk used to preach: read the Bible every day, do what the Bible says, and tell other people what the Bible has to say. And if we could all get our minds around that and do it, these problems could quickly be resolved. Um, of course, we need to pray and pray without ceasing, as the Bible says. But as somebody that I heard speak a couple of years ago, he said, yes, we need to pray, but when we get up off of our knees, we've got to put feet to our prayer. Faith without works is dead. So we pray in faith, but then we need to do something. I think it was written in the journal of a World War I soldier at one point. I think they found him dead. If I remember the story correctly, they found him dead on the battlefield. And his journal was on him, and when they were looking through it, one of the things he had written in his journal was that he felt a tremendous responsibility to the war effort. And he said every day he prayed like the entire issue was dependent on God. And then he fought as though the entire issue were dependent on him.
Yeah.
And
I
I
remember
really wish
reading that.
we could grip that.
Powerful.
And every day I want to pray for America. I want to pray for the church. I want to pray for our people, and pray so fervently as if the entire matter depended on God, which it does. But as soon as I get off my knees, I need to get to work. I need to do things and work as if it all depended on me. And I don't think those two things are at odds with each other at all. We need to be involved in our communities. So if we want to fix this, to people who are watching and listening, go find a good Bible-based New Testament church in your community and join it. Faithfully attend. Invest your money. Pay your tithe, your offering. Support missions. Support the community. And if the church you join doesn't do that, either find a different church or start those ministries at the church that you attend. Be involved in your church. Be involved in your community. Be involved in your local government. Vote. Participate. As has been said, you can't pray for righteousness and then vote for wickedness. You can't pray for righteousness and not vote at all. We are ambassadors of Christ in this world according to Scripture. And as I've said before on this podcast, an ambassador is a political appointee. that is in one place representing another place, trying to advocate for the principles and the policies of the kingdom that sent them. And that's exactly what Christians are. We are ambassadors to this world, advocating for the principles and the policies of Christ and his kingdom in this world where we have been stationed, if you will, or assigned. And all of us should take that seriously, and we should actively be working every day to be the best ambassadors that we can possibly be.
100%. Yep. Starts right here with us. How about those listening? Step up. I gotta get looking at my real job here momentarily. I'm getting some people texting me about the presentation I gave last night, so I gotta follow up, see what stirred some hornets' nests, I think. So we'll see.
That's exciting, man. And for those
Yeah,
who,
we'll see.
who haven't, if you haven't tuned in before, Jim is a city councilman, and he has been very active in his community, as I would hope all your local politicians are. And if they're not, if you don't have local politicians like Jim, you need to go out and recruit them or become one yourself. Get them voted into office, people who will work for you. Jim has done a great job. That's what it's all about, fixing things at the local level. And Jim's doing it. We had a presentation last night that seemed to be very well received. And so I'm looking forward to see the results from that. Jim, appreciate what you do down in Charleston, brother.
Thanks, man. Thanks for all you're doing, for trying to bring accountability up in Virginia and the election process. It's a lot of hard work, and it's all we can do. Just keep plugging away. Do the best
Amen.
we can at our level.
Yep.
All right, brother. God bless. Enjoyed it. I'll see you soon.
All right, man.
All right.
Take care.
God bless, brother. All right. See you.